The United States has a long and complex history of military intervention around the world. From Vietnam to Latin America, the Middle East and beyond, the US has frequently employed its military might. This interventionist approach has been justified on various grounds, from containing communism to promoting democracy and safeguarding American interests. However, the effectiveness and ethical implications of these interventions remain subjects of intense debate. Critics argue that US interventions often destabilize regions, create power vacuums, and lead to unintended consequences. They point to examples like the overthrow of democratically elected governments in Latin America during the Cold War, or the rise of extremist groups in the aftermath of the Iraq War. These interventions, critics argue, have often exacerbated conflicts and undermined long-term stability. The US interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq loom large in any discussion of American foreign policy. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, following the 9/11 attacks, initially enjoyed broad international support. However, the protracted war, the resurgence of the Taliban, and the chaotic withdrawal of US forces in 2021 have raised serious questions about the effectiveness of the intervention. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, based on the Bush administration's claims of weapons of mass destruction, proved even more controversial. The war led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, destabilized the region, and fueled sectarian violence. While the US ultimately withdrew from Iraq in 2011, the country continues to grapple with the legacy of the war and the rise of groups like ISIS. Beyond Afghanistan and Iraq, the US has a long history of intervention in the Middle East. From supporting the Shah of Iran to intervening in Lebanon's civil war, the US has sought to shape the political landscape of the region. The US has also provided significant military and economic support to Israel, a key ally in the region. However, US interventions in the Middle East have often been met with mixed results. Critics argue that US support for authoritarian regimes, coupled with its military interventions, has fueled anti-American sentiment and contributed to instability in the region. They point to the rise of Islamic extremism as a direct consequence of US policies in the Middle East. The costs of US military interventions extend far beyond the immediate financial burden. The human cost, both in terms of American lives lost and the casualties inflicted on the populations of the countries involved, is immeasurable. Moreover, interventions often create a climate of fear and instability, leading to displacement, human rights abuses, and long-term social and economic consequences. Furthermore, the focus on military solutions can divert resources and attention from other pressing global issues, such as climate change, poverty, and pandemics. Critics argue that a more sustainable and ethical approach to foreign policy would prioritize diplomacy, development, and multilateral cooperation over unilateral military action. The debate over the role of US military intervention in the world is likely to continue for years to come. However, the experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere have highlighted the need for a critical reassessment of American foreign policy. A more nuanced and restrained approach, one that prioritizes diplomacy, multilateralism, and a deep understanding of local contexts, is essential. Moreover, the US must confront the unintended consequences of its past interventions and work towards a more just and equitable world order. This requires a commitment to addressing the root causes of conflict, such as poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity, rather than relying solely on military solutions. The legacy of US military interventions remains a complex and contested issue. While proponents argue that interventions have at times protected American interests and promoted democracy, critics point to the often destabilizing and counterproductive effects of military action. The challenge for US policymakers is to learn from the mistakes of the past and chart a more prudent and ethical course for the future. This requires a shift away from unilateralism and militarism towards a foreign policy grounded in diplomacy, cooperation, and a commitment to human rights and international law. Ultimately, the true measure of US foreign policy lies not in its military might, but in its ability to foster a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world.